2 of the presentation of Consumers for Dental Choice and the World Alliance for Mercury-Free Dentistry, and a video production for the International Academy of Biological Dentistry and Medicine. We're now to 2010 in this story, this explanation of both how we've gotten to where we are, winning, marching toward mercury-free dentistry, why the public policy angle has been the right angle and how to move forward, and the role that individual dentists and consumers can play as we go down this march and go down toward the goal, which we will reach with the right strategy and the right team sticking together, which is mercury-free dentistry worldwide. We were a national organization until 2010, but along came an incredible opportunity, the Minamata Convention on Mercury. It wasn't called that, but when President Obama took office in 2009, he had been the United States senator most focused on mercury. He'd written laws on mercury, and he was aware of the need for a worldwide treaty. And this was quite unusual for the nations to decide to write a treaty on just one toxin. There had not been a major treaty on toxins at all in the 21st century, and there had not been any treaty dealing with just one form, one toxic material, element, in this case, mercury. But President Obama, as soon as he took office, directed that the State Department at the meeting in February of 2009 in Nairobi, and that's every 2 years, the world environmental ministers, in our case the State Department, always leads our delegation with the Environmental Protection Administration and with them, convene to decide what's next, what's new for the environment, what should we do. And at that point, the U.S. proposed what it had not supported, the government had not supported until then, an actual binding legal instrument. We would call it a treaty. They call it a convention addressing solely mercury. And that started the ball rolling fast. So by the beginning of 2010, there was a plan in place to have 5 meetings over 3 years, 5 plenary sessions of all the nations of the world, plus the international groups, plus what they call civil society, which would be the nonprofit groups, what they call NGOs, non-government organizations. I want to say they, I'm talking the United Nations lingo, and specifically the United Nations Environmental Program, which was the arm of the UN addressing the mercury issue. So the world was poised to sit down in Stockholm in June of 2010 to start discussing how they could put together in just 5 sessions, and when we're talking 150 countries, civil society, the room was full of 1,000 people, certainly. How are we going to move this ball forward? People, of course, of experience go to this. That's fortunate. So I decided in February 2010 to create a alliance. I called it Alliance, and I called it World Alliance. That was pretty ambitious, I must say. We were not a world organization, but I was ready to go toe-to-toe with the World Dental Federation, the pro-mercury, kind of like the ADA on steroids. I mean, just the worst of the worst in terms of combining support for mercury with a viewpoint that the poor countries should always have amalgam. Maybe the rich countries don't. This condescending superiority of this European-based organization, and British and American and other dental associations, and with on the take, if you will, because they get money, for example, the largest candy company in the world, Mars Candy. And it's funny how they so rarely talk about sugar, even though they want to talk about cavity prevention. They never tell you how, because they're not very interested in cavity prevention, actually. So anyway, that was our opponent, and I said, let's call us the World Alliance for Mercury-Free Dentistry, quite descriptive. So I wrote a letter to the few NGOs that I knew. That's on the screen there: friend, ami, amigo, Freund, amico, von, just a few words of French and German and Swedish and I don't know what else, Italian, whatever I could think of, only to Europe, because that's the only place I knew anybody there. But I didn't call it the Transatlantic Alliance. I said, let's create an umbrella, and that says the words. We wanted a global umbrella, and we were ready to go. So by the time we hit Stockholm, June of 2010, we were ready to recruit a worldwide team, and we began. We found at that point our leader for the Middle East. We found our leader for Africa. At the meeting after that, we found our leader for East Asia, then our meeting for South Asia, the meeting after that, South America, the meeting after that. We basically created an organization that indisputably today represents the world. We bring women and men from all parts of the earth, that's the delegates. The delegates come from all over the earth. Our team comes from all over the earth. So let's tell you where the World Dental Federation came from. Look at that slide. That's the World Dental Federation. Not too many women in that. You see that? You see very many Africans or Asians? Not too many. Actually, they just figured a bunch of, that's the way they've always operated. The ADA and the World Dental Federation and the British Dental and the German. It's just this idea that we're so smart, everybody will automatically listen to us. So they just walk in. The Thai Brigade is what we called them. You can see why. They were not very effective. They were not very effective. They thought everyone would have to listen to them, and they weren't. On the other hand, they had their minions inside the health agencies all over the world. Just like they have their minions inside FDA and Health Canada, they have their minions everywhere else. So it was a real struggle to get this going. But we were ready. And again, I want to thank, as I did in part one, this is the part 2 of 3, part 1 of the dentists and some physicians and consumers who donated every year to this idea. We just had an idea. We were ready. We had the talent. We had the energy. We needed funding to send people. You just can't raise much money in Bangladesh or Uruguay or the Ivory Coast, folks. We needed to be the ones to get the team from place to place and assemble this incredibly talented group of NGO leaders from everywhere. We had the data, and our strategy, I want to tell you, was environment. And keep that in mind. That was the winning strategy. This was an environmental treaty. And we wanted the environmental ministers front and center. We didn't want the health ministers. We knew the health ministers all over the place thought like the FDA does. Were they ever going to do anything? Of course not. They never would have without this. But with this, even the FDA had to yield ground step by step. We had meetings first in Stockholm, the second one in near Tokyo, the third in Nairobi, the fourth in Uruguay, the fifth in Geneva, and then the signing ceremony back to Japan. Then we had a sixth in Bangkok and a seventh at the Dead Sea. We're done with that. We will begin the next round later in as I tape this, it's January 2017, and this will begin under the calendar being agreed to. Now look at the tons a year. Look how big a problem dental amalgam is. See, we have the quantity issue going for us, folks, and that's why we could say we got to do something. Opposing us, the Pro-Mercury World Dental Federation, we call it Pro-Mercury American Dental Association, Pro-Mercury British Dental Association. Put Pro-Mercury right in your vocabulary here. The Pro-Mercury World Dental Federation didn't want to be in the treaty. Didn't want to be in the treaty. And they could not handle the environmental. It really threw them off balance. We had the quantity issue, we had the pollution issue, and we had where it goes. It goes everywhere. Remember, you could have the best separator in the world, and there are some great separator companies and some not so great, might add. But most of the mercury walks out of the office. Walks out of the office. We're not going to put a separator on every toilet. We're not going to have a breathing device to catch the mercury that we breathe out. Burial, cremation. Are we going to make the funeral directors pay for crematory devices? They do in Britain. It's just any way these pro-mercury dentists can pass the cost to somebody else. Landlords, of course they pass the cost to landlords because it's in the pipes. It's time they bore the burden. And in fact, we've got data. I guess that slide's coming in a minute. We'll get to that in a minute. Here it is. Well, I'm out of order. Here's my fault. Okay, here we are. That's where the amalgam goes, all over the place. Here's the data. And then, anyway, and that's on our website. We commissioned a report. An economist told us that the real cost of dental amalgam, I'm not talking health. We know the health costs are great, but they're very hard to quantify. The environmental cost can be quantified. $87 a filling more. An amalgam costs $87 a filling more than the composite when you count the environmental costs. Of course, we should count it. Governments need to count it. Great part of our message. That report, its summary was translated into about 8 languages, including Chinese. We wanted to get that message out a lot of directions. One of the places it goes is the fish. And the European Commission that studied this pointed out that amalgam is a secondary poisoning. Secondary poisoning. It gets in the fish that the children then eat. So if they tell you amalgam's safe, tell them at the very least it's a secondary poisoning. Nobody can dispute that. It gets in the fish. If children eat the fish, it's mercury toxic for them. Now we persevered. There were 5 regional meetings that I mentioned, 5 national meetings. There were regional meetings everywhere. Every region had a meeting before the world meeting. There were interim sessions. There was one session after another. We just kept being there. Anytime, if 80% of life is showing up, we showed up. We had a great team, and we're really proud of the people, the men and women from everywhere, I assure you, who showed up. And there are some of them from everywhere. You look at that slide in the lower left, I mean, you got people from New Zealand, Cameroon, France, Uruguay, Ivory Coast, United States, France again, United States again, Lebanon, Philippines, Bangladesh, Mauritius. That's one of the pictures. We had a lot more. We did it, but I'm telling you, it was as close a call as you could have, because 3 times this thing didn't get in and stayed and got back in. First, it wasn't supposed to be in at all. Australia, Canada, they didn't want it in at all. We had to get it in. And then they wanted it in as a waste product. Would have been a horrible decision. Why? You would have just spent money on waste equipment instead of getting rid of it. It's not a waste issue. It's a use issue. How do you deal with toxics? You stop using them. Source reduction. Common sense. They didn't want common sense. They wanted to keep this going. At the 4th session in Montevideo, we almost lost it. It was the Africans who rescued us. The Africans rescued us and kept it in. And we'll get to the Africans in a minute. But a lawyer from Ethiopia named Won Wilson just would not let go when the Australian and the Canadian kept trying to maneuver this thing. And the Australian was presiding, see, was the trouble. He wouldn't even recognize. I mean, it was amazing. He would not recognize this talented African lawyer who kept wanting to speak because he knew what he had to say. But Won Wilson outmaneuvered him, and we kept it in. One more time, we almost lost it. The governments decided to have their own private meeting without us, without civil society, the nonprofit groups and so on, in Tokyo to try to speed it up because they were running out of time before the 5th and final session. And they went to Tokyo and they decided to take out things. And they took out amalgam. It was out of the tree. They got back and it wasn't in the draft. Well, I want to credit my wife, Ann Swanson, as I did in the first one on the First Amendment. She said to me, "You got to do something." You know, we were in trouble. She said, "Go have breakfast with the chairman of the treaty, who's a Uruguayan, very talented. He is the guy that presided at this session when we're talking 1,000 people. You know, the nonprofits group sit way in the back. You know, I'm sitting 100 yards from this guy. You know, as if to say this guy, I've shook his hand, but I shook his hand by then. I said, as if to say this guy. She said, go have breakfast with him. I said, well, first, where do I have breakfast with him? And 2, he's not going to have breakfast with me anyway. She said, well, everybody comes to Washington. All diplomats at some point have to have meetings in Washington. And second, why wouldn't he? He has to have breakfast like anybody else. So I said, okay, I'll waste my time. I'll write him. He said, yes. He said, yes. We had breakfast, my associate Sylvie Dove, plus Fernando Lugris, that's his name, plus the very top guy with the United Nations Environmental Program addressing this treaty, Jacob Dewar, and the 4 of us. And I said, you need to pay attention to the African position. And I want to back up on that because how that happened. And then I'm going to go back to Fernando Lugris. In 2010 in Stockholm, here was the discussion. And this is horrible, but this is the discussion, which was we can phase down amalgam. We can phase it out in Europe, but the African children must have amalgam. And I decided that minute, We were going to have a campaign in Africa. We were not going to have this. Maybe some of you know about the history of lead paint. Lead paint was abolished in America, Canada, Europe. No lead paint. There's lead paint still in old buildings, and it's terrible for children, but there's no new lead paint going on in houses. Not true in Latin America, not true in Africa, not true in South Asia. Lots of lead paint. The paint companies just sold the lead paint other places. We kept lead paint going. And I said in 2010, I resolved this would not be a lead paint issue. I asked to speak to the African delegation, and I did. I took my French colleague, Marie Grossman, from France, so we could speak in English and French. You know, French is the other major national language of Africa. There's some countries that are neither. They're Arabic, Ethiopian, Swahili, but most countries have English or French. And most educated people, all educated Africans, not all, almost all, can speak either English or French. So that's what you do. You speak in English or French. And she spoke French. And we got the volunteer we needed, Dominique Belly of La Côte d'Ivoire, and we started our campaign. That was INC 1, the first session in Stockholm. Before the fifth session, the last one coming in Geneva, there was a meeting in Pretoria. And we had our African team there from Mauritius and South Africa, from Côte d'Ivoire, and they presented to the delegates a plan that we had proposed to plan to address amalgam. Phase it out or not, phase it down, but specific steps, how to do it. And they proposed it. And it was adopted. So the African delegation became the champions of having an amalgam plank. So back to the breakfast, I said to Senor Lugris, I said, are you aware of the African plan on amalgam? He said, I'm very aware of it. He said, that's usually diplomatic for, I'm going to do it. We weren't sure, but he did do it. He kept it in INC 5. And this picture right here is Senor Lugris and me. He's a Uruguayan, and the lady in the middle between him and me is our leader for all of South America for Uruguay, Maria Carcamo. And we are this is celebrating. This is after an all-night session, INC 5 in Geneva. If you could see it up close, I probably won't show it to you because the people were hardly awake, but it was a very exciting picture. Actually, it's in this photo. That's the same photo on this screen here of all these people. Now, I want to show you what it looks like. This is when I said I couldn't see so far Fernando Lugris. My view was worse than this. I was farther away. If you look at the very top row, that was me, and you look at the row in the front, that's where Fernando and the other bigwigs sat. But we were able to break through and get Fernando there. And the final word, after a lot of back and forth, I assure you, and I assure you both sides were in the room, and it was tough. And then just the governments were in the room, but we had our allies, Norway, the African delegation. They had their allies with Canada, Australia. The U.S. was pretty good. Not great, but pretty good. And especially at the start, because it was the U.S. that first proposed among the major countries that we have a plan to phase out amalgam. They proposed that. They didn't get into specifics. The specifics came from the Africans, but we had enough wherewithal to get it in. So you can see the Minamata Convention on the PowerPoint. 1 requires parties to cut down amalgam use. 2 starts now with a plan. They got to start now. See, some of these products are phased out many, many years from now, but nobody has to do anything now. We need to start now, and we have started now. I can assure you we've started in dozens of countries right now, and it establishes a mechanism for setting a phase-out date. We know the mechanism. I'm a lawyer. I'm a former state attorney general, as I mentioned in the first part, and we understand the treaty. My associate's a lawyer. We know where we're going with this, and I assure you we are ready. So we ended up leaving Minamata with a great result. Amalgam, mercury fillings got in the treaty. Not every product did, as many of you know. Some of the products people had wanted in, didn't get in. We got in with a plan and with the energy. And the World Dental Federation, we went toe-to-toe with them. They were the ones that blinked. They lost. And we not only won, but we won with a very strong team of people who are ready to go. And as soon as things ended, we were ready to start implementing the language. Even before it was law, implementing, because when people signed it, and they all signed it in Japan in 2013, when I say all, more than 100 countries signed it. Not in everybody, but 120, and that's almost every country, and every major country, I believe, just about. We were ready from that point in October of 2013 to start implementing. So we're done with part 2 of this presentation. We have one more part 3, and we'll sign off and rejoin you as soon as you're ready. We'll do part 3.